So thank you so much, Chris and Alicia, for joining us today. The topic, deconstructing the future of work. My goodness, the future of work seems to be a phrase that pre-COVID world we were reading a lot about. In a post-COVID environment, in a transformational environment, it's relentless. But do we actually really understand it? And I think that's why we're absolutely delighted to have you both join us. Most organisations have a purpose, but at times really get lost in that journey, how they get there. The team from Equate have an approach that aligns your organisational purpose with your workforce, your people, and strategic workforce planning to create value ultimately for all. 2021 and beyond is going to continue to throw up significant challenges. And understanding the future of work for your organisation is really going to be critical in that ongoing success. So let me introduce you to the expert panel we have today. Chris Hare. Chris is actually a long-time connection of the Next Step, and very kindly, I think this is his second discussion with us. So thanks, Chris, for joining us. He's balanced his career across consulting and the corporate world. One of his final roles in the corporate environment was General Manager Planning, Rewards and Sourcing for the NBN Co. Now that must have been a challenging opportunity. I would imagine during this kind of work is where you really kind of saw the opportunities ahead and co-founded with Alicia Equate Consulting in 2014. Alicia, the co-founder and CEO as well of Equate Consulting, chartered accountant, MBA graduate, who also spent a significant amount of time in both corporate and consulting. Qantas, one of her final roles at Qantas was the head of strategic workforce planning, analytics and resourcing. And looking at the years when you were in that role, it must have been quite a contemporary view of taking around analytics and workforce planning. And then obviously they joined up to form Equate Consulting. Chris, Alicia, it appears that most workplaces and organisations at the moment are really in this deep period of rapid and significant transformation. Transformation, how to use technology differently, transforming how we work, transforming where and why we work. And so it certainly seems that this piece around strategic workforce planning is more critical than ever. However, in the work that I do working across multiple organisations, at times it feels it's only the kind of the big ASX, the organisations that you've both been part of, that really invest in teams and how to do strategic workforce planning. So I know that many of the people on this webinar will be really keen to understand how can they take some of these key principles into their organisations and the work that they do if they may not have the size, teams and resources to be able to deliver as some of them else have. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to learn more on this topic.
Thank you, Joe. We're delighted to be here. And Alicia, if you want to push just to the next slide, I'll briefly say, following on from what Joe has introduced us, we have been very passionate about strategic workforce planning for a number of years for a number of reasons. We're going to take you through a little bit, as Joe says, what can you do now that takes those principles and helps you understand this whole world of future of work and all the transformation that we're all experiencing. We have built a world-leading software as a service platform to drive strategic workforce planning. And that's taken us to quite a few customers overseas as well as domestically. And Joe's quite right. This tends to be something that large enterprises really know that they want to focus and invest in. And it's an emerging discipline. And there's a lot of different definitions of it. We're going to take you through a bit of a version that's hopefully a bit more digestible that you can take back and use in your own work. So, funnily enough, we created this slide before COVID, and we had a little word down there at the bottom that said shocks. So yes, the world is changing. And all of these items that are on this list were pertinent pre-COVID, including shocks. We've experienced shocks before, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But now, after all of us having gone through COVID, we could probably put shocks up to the top of this slide. The world is changing. It's changing rapidly, and it's changed very rapidly. Before COVID, we kind of had this feeling, I think, across most of our discipline that there was this constant change syndrome. And it's like, where do we start next and what do we do? And then all this future work stuff is coming in. Do we even need to think about it? Is it something we can just ignore? Well, I think now, having come through COVID, all of us know the future of work is now.
That's right. The robots are here. So if we just look at this video, to that point that the robots are here, pre-COVID, my husband used to travel for work and he was in San Francisco. And there was a big gathering on the sidewalk watching this robot barista or robarista, and partial to a latte and looking for that ever elusive perfect cup of coffee, he thought he'd give it a try. And whilst the robarista did not have the beard, the skinny jeans, or the witty banter, it did do a pretty good cup of coffee. However, what we see is there is not one, not two, but at least 3 people required to work alongside this robarista. And whilst this will no doubt change over time, as consumers get more used to the technology improves, and then eventually the robot handlers become less, how do you as an organisation take into account the variables that will impact the trajectory as consumer adoption accelerates, technology improves, consumer demand changes, and they decide they want more complex blends or whatever it is? How do you forecast, plan, and actually ensure you've got the right mix of people to support the journey of your organisation and where things like technology will impact you? How do you deconstruct that future of work to make it meaningful for your organisation? Because we're not here to roll out all the stats. I know we open up any newsfeed, LinkedIn, email these days, and we all see the robots are coming for our job. But what we want to see is that change is accelerating. So what used to take many decades to implement now only takes a year or sometimes only a few months. And consumer adoption is increasingly rapid. You know, in the time that I just said that sentence, an algorithm executed 1,000 stock trades, a computer processed 3 million credit card transactions, and 17 packages were packed and shipped by robots at the Amazon warehouse. So change is real. We know it's with us. And so how do we adapt and interpret that for us? Because the reality is, whilst the technology is changing at an exponential rate, organizations generally don't keep pace. Interestingly, the individual rate of adoption, as we saw earlier, sits somewhere in the middle of here. But what we see with this exponential tech change and the logarithmic company change is that we get this widening gap. And often what we need is some sort of shock to reset and give us that step change to bring organizations. And, you know, that's what we all saw during 2020, where we all had to pivot on a dime and everyone was remote working suddenly. So we know that changes in behavior and culture take time. And there are only so many changes that organizations can absorb at one time in people, processes, and technology. But how do we really step back and see what this means for us as HR practitioners?
So let's talk about us as HR practitioners. We spend so much time on future work around our businesses. What about the future for HR? Who do we want to be? HR has been under a lot of pressure to change and has done a lot and has evolved over time, no doubt. I think we can all agree it's no good anymore to be the HR person who's a people person. The function has to be the people expert within the business. And so we're not really talking about a revolution here, but we know that we're spending a lot of time as transformation enablers, but we have to go further. We have to, again, not a revolution, but we have to get an elevation of the function. And what do we mean by that? We have to move from the seat at the table, being the good listener, to really the strategic transformation partner, the part of the organization that understands people are the vehicle for the execution of strategy. And to get there, strategic workforce planning is needed. And that takes a slight change in philosophy. And it remains the major gap for HR, not just here in Australia and not just among large companies, but globally.
So just a quick question, and I can't see you all, but this is one that we love to put out there often. So it's really understanding, do you know what workforce, so what mix, size, shape, capabilities your organization needs today? When we ask that question, it's roughly about 1 in 10 people that put up their hands and have some sort of view, which is pretty amazing to me, because the workforce is usually one of the largest costs for an organization, if not the largest cost. It is arguably the biggest asset for your organization. It is the source of competitive advantage, according to many publications, including the Harvard Business Review. So not having an understanding of what you need today is a pretty shocking state of affairs. If we ask the same question and say, what about in 5 years from now? Do you have any view of the workforce size, shape, capabilities, mix that your organization needs in 5 years or even 3 years? What's amazing is that 0 organizations, when we survey, have a view of this. Again, it's really disturbing, because how do you understand how to get your organization where it needs to be, recognizing that the organization is the workforce is the organization. And 100% of organizations surveyed say their organization will look different in 3 or 5 years. So every single organization knows it's going to look different. And again, what are organizations? They're the people in them. So how do you make yourself kind of go through that transformation in the most optimal way if you don't have a plan?
So let's talk about future of work. Future of work sits here at the top of this pyramid. And it's a useful way for us to think about the things that we know down at workforce tracking and operational planning, rostering, workforce management kind of stuff. I think people understand to a large extent, and it's been done a lot. And there's certainly tricks around optimizing it, but people get what that means. And then future of work sits there at the top, and it really represents the world of what could be, not necessarily what should be. And what it misses is that lens of what your organization is trying to do. You hopefully have some semblance of a business plan or strategy, or if you're in the not-for-profit sector, you have a mandate that you're trying to fulfill. And to do that, you have a customer value proposition of some description that requires all of your workforce across the value chain to deliver. Strategic workforce planning simply looks at that, and it says, how are we trying to do that over time? Over, say, 3 to 5 years, how are we lifting and lowering and changing how our purpose manifests? And then we compare that to future of work. If we don't have that lens, it's really hard to deconstruct what these future of work statistics mean. Alicia is going to take us through shortly some things that help really highlight that. But without that kind of picture of what we need, that picture of demand, it really makes future of work data meaningless. So let's talk about that. Strategic workforce planning is this overall philosophy that houses 2 major important components. Demand forecasting. What do we need to do against our purpose, regardless of what we got? And that's the amount that we're trying to forecast out into the future. The other thing that sits under amount in strategic workforce planning is what we call dynamic scenarios. The future is not certain. There's lots of different views across your organizations on what's going to happen when and what it will mean. You have to drive a shared conversation so that leaders agree. This helps us in both the amount and the alignment piece really get this clarity around what is our purpose and what's it going to take to get there through people. And then sitting there in the middle is the major output that most people recognize from strategic workforce planning. What are the buy, build, borrow actions that we're going to take? If you're not looking at these other components and driving a shared view with leadership and thinking about what's our agreed view of the future, it's very hard to make these correct decisions on what HR programs to prioritize, which roles to invest in, how to have a conversation with people and take them on this journey through the future of work.
That's right. So as Chris mentioned, the fundamental purpose of strategic workforce planning is what we consider to be one of the most important questions an organisation can ask. What is our purpose and what is it going to take for us to get there? And that second part of the question, the to get there part, is recognising that The workforce is the execution vehicle. It is the to get their part. So how do we create that inherent alignment of our workforce capability and capacity to the activities we need to be doing across our value chain to support the achievement of our strategy and purpose? We do that through strategic workforce planning. So we translate that strategy into a value chain and the activities that generate a need for the workforce. So simply, what do we need? When do we need it? And what capabilities or skills does that need to have? We then look at what we've got and compare where there are differences, where we're over or under in capacity or capability. And as Chris said, we create that action plan. We create a coherent set of actions across all workforce related initiatives, not just the ones in HR that touch the employee lifecycle, but also things like technology enablement or process efficiency, anything that hits the workforce. And that's the critical part here. We're integrating so many moving parts. We're integrating our internal demand. We're integrating the dynamics across our current workforce and supply, like retirement, turnover, mobility. We're also bringing in that external view. So what's going on in the skills market? Where have we got shortfalls? Where have we got emerging skills or changes? And also that external shock context. So obviously we're not operating in a silo. So how do we understand the potential what ifs? And we do that through that dynamic scenario construct that Chris mentioned. So we'll now show you how setting the context through business strategy and demand planning really gives you that basis to deconstruct the future of work for your organization and then create the HR strategies that will align to your business strategy and deliver that real impact for your organization. So what we've got here is a simplified simulation, but the same construct applies to any role in any industry. We've taken customer service agent because it's industry agnostic and it's broadly applicable. Most people have got some sort of form of this in their organization.
And so to Joe's point, one of the things we would say is this lens that Alicia is about to take you through this next simulation is the kind of thinking that you should apply to your most critical roles, regardless of what size organization or industry you're in.
Absolutely. The same construct applies whether you've got 10 employees or 10,000 or 10 million. Okay, so if we take this particular role and we look at any given future of work report, there's many databases, there's an engine you can type in on the internet and say, will a robot take my job? And it'll tell you the likelihood. We've picked a middle of the road range here for this role, which says 55% less of this workforce will be needed in the future because a lot of its tasks and activities can be automated, which is really interesting. However, when we look at the organization's customer value proposition, its customer journey, competitive advantage, its risk appetite for tech adoption, and so on, we see that yes, it is going to invest in technology, but it's doing it at a different rate and pace to what a future of work report might say. So yes, it's got, say, a channel shift initiative happening in 2 years. It's resulting in 20% need for that workforce. However, we've also got a whole set of new capabilities that we need to bring into the picture to support the technology, like the robot managers or even just data scientists to deal with all the cool insights you're going to get from your new systems. Plus, the roles that remain may be called the same thing, but their underlying skills and capabilities are now fundamentally different because no longer are they doing the high volume, low complexity kind of interactions with customer. They're now doing really complex niche customer offerings that require a whole new skill set. So we have to reskill them. So this is how we need to start deconstructing all the moving parts of future of work that often get lost in just a headline stat that says the robots are coming for your job.
That's right. And this helps give us a coherence around where are we taking this organization? What are we trying to achieve for our customer? And what are we going to need to achieve it through our own people? And if you can see that picture, if you know it, you can then be active. You can help your employees understand how they fit in growing your commercial outcomes, as well as delivering in their own personal growth. And there can be nothing stronger for your employee value proposition than that level of clarity. In fact, we would argue that you cannot be a socially responsible employer unless you find a way to take your organization to look forward. If you can't see what's coming, there's no way that you can have an honest conversation with employees on where they're going. So what's the cost if we don't get this right? And we talked before about constant change syndrome that we probably had pre-COVID. There's another one that I know a lot of us have suffered through: restructure fatigue. This is where we react and lurch, and sometimes we call it being agile, but it's really just waiting for things to happen, and then we quickly spend a lot of effort to figure out how we're going to recalibrate ourselves. And the problem with this is you can maybe get away with that a few decades ago, where you restructure every 2 or 3 years as pressure built up. But honestly, now you could probably restructure every 2 or 3 months. And some organizations we deal with could restructure even more quickly than that.
Constantly. Yeah.
The thing is, restructuring is not the same as strategic workforce planning. Strategic workforce planning is looking forward and trying to anticipate shifting winds years ahead of time and make adjustments to how we prioritize roles and how we prioritize programs, and consider the future of work and how we can bring in things that enable us to be commercially sustainable and grow our people.
So I'm just going to jump to another simulation now, just to illustrate the concept a bit more. We're going to have a look at the same role, but this time a dynamic that you're possibly more familiar with around employee turnover. So what we're looking at here is the number of employees that leave the role. So they may be leaving the organization through resignation or retirement, or they may be leaving the role to go to another role in the organization. But let's say for this group, it's got an employee turnover where about 1 in 4 workforce members leave this role each year. Ordinarily, what most organizations do is they backfill. They just hire into that existing supply. Okay, that person's left, rehire, and that becomes the recruitment plan, that becomes the default workforce plan. However, when we overlay that translation of business strategy into our demand, bringing in those future workforces, we see that we've got a bit of a problem, because we actually need less of this workforce. So if we were just to continue on our merry way and backfill into that existing supply level, we're going to end up with a dynamic that's not that great: oversupply. We're carrying too much of the workforce we don't need, which is not great from a cost perspective, obviously, and we've got people sitting around idle. The other dynamic that we see play out, and I'm sure you've seen forms of this through the year that was 2020, is the recruitment freeze. I started my career in finance, and certainly it was something that would often be done as a measure to just get a control and hold on to things where we didn't have a sense of where things were heading in the future. So we just do a recruitment freeze. But the problem with that, having that blue line, that construct of what we need and when, is that we don't know when to turn that recruitment freeze back off. So we end up with the dynamic of we don't have enough people to do the roles. And again, when we're saying roles here, we're using that interchangeably with skills as well. So it's basically not the right capability and capacity to do what we need to. And when we don't have the right capability and capacity, this is a top line impact for organizations. This is where we're missing customer demand, we're missing transformation milestones or project deliverables. This is stuff that has a severe impact on our organization, and from a commercial perspective, it is tangible and it is real. So this is why it's absolutely fundamental for us to take that forward-looking view and mitigate our risk to this happening to us. I'll just do one more simulation quickly, again, to just deconstruct some of the future of work trends. This role is a UX specialist. This is one that is predicted by all the future work stats to be having significant increase in demand. For our own organization, we are looking for this skill as well. It's very important as we all become more digitally enabled through our transformation journeys. But what we find is often...
Just Alicia, sorry, just before we really jump into this one, which is a good one, Jo's got her hand up.
Oh, apologies, Jo.
No. I was just very, very conscious that your last model was I guess, so pertinent to so many of the conversations that I guess the HR and HSE community are having at the moment. And specifically with the kind of the additional complexity that we've got with borders being shut down, and that flow both within Australia and internationally of talent coming back, that flow backwards and forwards, that not only have we've got roles in, current, because organizations are in transformation, evolving roles, but potentially what we're seeing is a natural backfill, put somebody onto a project, backfill with that substantive role, but without the real vision of what's happening in year 1, year 2, year 3 of that transformation.
Mm-hmm.
Additionally, I think we're just very used to, in that buy, borrow, build mindset, to just buy talent. And the reality is, in this current environment, that buy talent pipeline is diminishing rapidly. Absolutely. As organizations look after their employees. Salaries are having a significant uplift after being fairly muted for the last kind of 2-3 years. And then, as I mentioned, that flow from of actual available talent. So it seems that this model is even more critical right now for where we're at.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's very well said. Historic strategic workforce planning was very headcount only based. And it was therefore a lot of a business case around buy, or another B that we use. We use 6 Bs, don't we, Alicia? Bounce.
Very shortly.
Yeah, bounce, which is a nice way to say, it can be reduce some of the things you do, but it can also be reducing workforce. Build is so critical. And the only way you can do build is through skills forecasting. And the only way skills forecasting makes sense is if you know what volume and size and shape you need to be in the future, and what skills you therefore need to deploy. So it's a very nuanced, deep view that we need to get, so that we're not just constantly either rehiring or we're missing customer capacity, and trying to win them back, as we all know, is very hard.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, Alicia, for interrupting. I just thought it was good to mention, given the context of where we're at the moment.
Perfect,
no, definitely. And it kind of goes to the next point anyway, where I'm going to be talking a little bit about the gig economy and the emergence of different modes of employment other than just permanent, but that temp kind of basis, freelancers and so on. Often we if we go back to 2015, there was this report that was published that was really widely cited, that was saying that the gig economy is going to be 50% of the workforce by 2020 or something crazy. And then we kind of got to about 2018, 2019, and they're like, oh, it's still only a smaller proportion. We'll revise those statistics. And then 2020 happened. And what we've seen through 2020 is that employees now have a different basis for understanding how they can tap into the skills they need, other than just the permanent employment model. So that works when you've got an understanding that your demand looks like this. So you've potentially got starts and stops, you've got ramp ups and ramp downs, and you've got periods of time where you don't need the skills at all. And often for organizations, their internal available supply looks like this. So they've got low or zero of this available within their current organization, because it's not part of their core business model. And the permanent available supply can often be not enough to meet the needs of everyone. And you're competing with everyone else who also wants these in demand skills. And so it becomes a bit of an issue, because even if you were to hire every single one of them, there'd be periods of time you're carrying them and you don't need them, which some organizations decide, yep, we're keen to do that because, the risk of not having them when we need them is so great. But you've still got this issue where you've got undersupply. There's not enough that you can get your hands on to do what you need to do. However, by understanding what you need and when, through that forward-looking construct, you can tap into this whole other alternative means of accessing the skills that you need when you need it. And so again, we're just bringing back that lens that it really starts with understanding what you need and when, to be able to deconstruct the future of work meaningfully.
So it turns out I get to be the kind of dark person on a lot of these slides. So here's another dark slide from me. 88% of the Fortune 500 companies that we grew up with are no longer in existence. Planning is not a second order kind of activity. We have to look forward. We have to see where we're going, or we won't. Not only will we not survive, not only will we not thrive, we may not even survive. So what we really advocate for here is to be active. The future of work isn't just about buy. It isn't just about bouncing activities out. it's really this whole spectrum of things that you can do. You have to get the executive leadership team to care and create a fit for purpose HR program and tech program to boost efficiency and create business cases. That's the way to get your executives to not only endorse programs, but to be active participants in them. We don't see strategic workforce planning as one of the items on this laundry list. We see strategic workforce planning as defining this list. And that helps you bring in this component of future of work and discern, what does it mean for us? And which of these actions are we going to take in light of its changes and what we're trying to do as an organization?
That's right. So we're really trying to move away from that one size fits all approach. By having the context of our organization strategy and what we need in terms of the size and shape, we move away from the plethora of the actions we could do and focus on what we really should do to move the needle for our organization. So overlaying those internal dynamics of supply and demand with the external future of work trends and changing cultures and values and all of those kind of factors, we can see that we would undertake quite different initiatives based on different trends for different segments within our population. So with segment 1, you can see it's got a few different things happening, including some of the future of work forces that come into play through the emerging trends and shapes of preferences that society has, versus a different segment that may have quite different dynamics and be impacted by, for example, technology in a different way, but we still need them. How do we kind of shape our tailored actions across the employee lifecycle and all workforce initiatives across those 6 Bs to really shape and shift and make sure that we're focusing on what we need to as an HR function? And this is really a different way of looking at things, because it's kind of rotating that business partner model into that true sense of being a true business partner, because we're actually looking to the future at what's going to be a showstopper for our organization and making sure we're taking the actions that will mitigate that risk. And the impact of this is huge stuff. So not only are we deconstructing the future of work, which is absolutely vital in getting an understanding and contextualizing that for our own business and its journey, but that leadership alignment's huge. You know, the number of times we've been in rooms with the CEO, CFO, COO, and CHRO, and they've looked across the table and they've just all thought things were moving in different directions. They've interpreted the strategy of the organization through their own functional perspective, which means there's a bit of a disconnect. In using the workforce as the common denominator, we're creating that alignment and accelerating the organization in the right direction. Risk mitigation, so absolutely making sure that we're able to execute what we need to as an organization. That's absolutely fundamental. It's something that's hitting the board radars increasingly. You know, how are we making sure we've got the skills and capacity in our workforce to do what we need to? Cost optimization is always going to be there, whether we like it or not. We have to make sure our workforce is aligned to the activities we need to be doing, and we have to optimize those trade-offs around our build, buy, borrow decisioning. Agility, you know, again, Chris mentioned earlier, there's so many organizations calling themselves agile when it's just another way of reacting quickly. To build true agility into your operating model, you actually need to baseline it and get the right capability and capacity in the first place. Otherwise, you're just moving the wrong resources around to react. And social responsibility. Again, as Chris said, true social responsibility, you need to look forward. You need to have a plan for where you're going, and you need to bring your workforce on the journey with you. In fact, you know, the number one recommendation by the World Economic Forum for dealing with the future of work is strategic workforce planning. You know, it's the way to deal with what they're calling the reskilling revolution. It integrates all of those dynamic forces and makes sure your organization can navigate them in the most effective way.
So as a function, where do we want to go? How are we going to get there? A question that I love to ask when we're in a live audience and I can see people, because I can usually see some knowing smirks and glances. How many of us have been in organizations where McKinsey or BCG has come whipping through the place, and they've done their evaluation, they've come up with what they think you should do and which areas of the business should you push people out of? And we've felt when we've been in those organizations, this is going to hurt our customer value proposition, or this is going to hurt our long-term kind of trajectory. But we haven't had a way to push back and enunciate that. And so we've had to implement these things that we know are damaging, that we know are ruining our investment in EVP, but we haven't had a clear-eyed view of a counter argument. Well, you have to be active. You can't wait for this stuff to come. These shocks and these changes that come through, they're unexpected. If you don't have a model or a view of where things are going, when they come through, you have nothing to adjust from, and you're at the mercy of other people who will take these decisions away from the HR function. So be active. Otherwise, this is another one of my nice dark slides. We start to see some of that frustration building up with our function that we know and love. And the reason, by the way, that Alicia and I spend so much time in strategic workforce planning with HR is because we are the custodians of the workforce. Yes, this stuff appeals to finance-minded people. Yes, it appeals to the heads of strategy because it helps crystallize what they're trying to get the leadership team to sign up for. But ultimately, this function is the one that owns the people programs. We have to make sure that we become the people experts so that we really drive that integration of strategy and commercial with people. We at Equate have found now with our software that we're able to make strategic workforce planning more digestible. It is something that takes some focus and effort. That is the major hurdle for companies figuring out how to grab demand and how to figure this out. But we've now distilled that process down to a 4-week cycle to get an entire strategic workforce plan top down, high level enough to bring leadership into a discussion to figure out those buy, build, borrow actions that matter. And so what I would say, to Joe's point early on around organizations that are on the line, listed companies aren't necessarily doing this well. Medium-sized companies have to be doing this to survive. I would say strategic workforce planning is the foundation. It's not an aspiration. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. That was absolutely fantastic. And I must admit, I was one who was just thinking about my own role, my own team, my own organization, and drawing a little axis and thinking about the roles. And I think a few years ago, many of us thought the robots and the chatbots and the AI was going to take over some of our roles, but equally it's transitioning. What are some of those new roles within even my own industry that are coming through? I think my team and I are on fast track learning, to your point around that transition of role with new HR domain roles that we've never recruited before, because people are in that pace of, whilst we may not need the and I'm just pulling this up off the top of my head, but we may not need some of those HR advisory team members because we now have really very, very sophisticated augmented reality chatbots, AI that can learn about your organization and how you might respond to a particular policy or process piece of information. But equally, suddenly there's these new HR data science roles. We're actually requiring a very different level of strategic business partner, and love the way you position it, Alicia. It's that business partner and utilizing some of those pieces. But that was absolutely fantastic, and I hadn't come across the 6 B's previously, so I'll have to add that into my remit. Now, I know this has obviously been really capturing presentation, so thank you both of you, because we've got everybody who joined at the start still on the line, so that's obviously a really good sense that the topics hit the mark. So I'm going to throw it over. Please, if anyone's got any questions that they'd love to ask Chris or Alicia, please feel free to use the Q&A box or the chat box. We'd be delighted to answer any specific questions that you might have. So we've got our first question from Candice, who's hopefully all the panel can see that question, but she's asking, as an HR practitioner, the need for strategic workforce planning is so clear. what data points or models or actions have you found to be most effective in driving commitment with business leaders? Great question. Thank you.
It's such a great question. And the challenge that we have in our HR discipline in advocating for SWP is our business leaders have never seen this before either. So it's not like they're going to come tap you on the shoulder and say, please do SWP for me, like my last 5 companies. And so it's an important question that Candace asks. How do you get people to understand what you're really trying to drive at? And what we found most effective is to center the discussion around dynamic scenarios. So Alicia talked a bit about demand, and we didn't talk a lot about dynamic scenarios today. But that's the whole view, that we want to have a business-centered discussion. Every organization will no doubt have some semblance of a business plan, but helping those leaders see that there's some choices within that business plan and there's some risks. And there's a fundamental difference. If we're a 2,000 person organization and we go slightly left, we could be 15, 20% larger, or we could be 40% smaller, or we could stay right on track. And those have much different implications for us in terms of what we invest in as a people function. So start that conversation around the demand and the demand modeling, and not so much on the HR analytics and the people data. Drive the conversation around a business-centered conversation that then gets tied back to people.
Yeah, and I just add to that, because the crux of the dynamic scenario planning is that it is in the language of the business. So we're actually talking about their volumes. We're talking about their sales targets, their customer volumes, whatever your business drivers are. We're talking about that and then denominating that back into a workforce demand. But because the conversation is very much centered around what they're familiar with and what they're used to talking about for their organization, you just get that engagement straight away. And as soon as you put some sort of number in front of them that relates to one of their business volumes, they want to engage. They want to tell you why it's wrong, why they've got a different view. It's just such a different conversation to qualitative and conceptual discussions. And that's where we really see the biggest kind of commitment from business leaders in this process.
We often find, don't we, Alicia, that when we're talking about this concept of dynamic scenarios, it's a new concept for most of HR. Usually when we start having that conversation jointly with HR and some of their business leaders, the business leaders have been in similar items and they recognize it a little faster. So I know it's maybe for some folk on the line, you hear dynamic scenarios and you go, what does that really mean? That's something that I would encourage everybody on this call to start to explore, because it's powerful and it helps you justify the things that you're trying to do.
I think that's always the main piece, isn't it? Is trying to get, and again, especially considering we're in this crazy, fast-paced, transforming, everybody's busy, is trying to get the attention of everybody. And if you can do that with just a slight change in the approach or the language or the tool, but ultimately getting the right outcome. It's a really interesting point you make, Chris, around utilising that dynamic scenario planning over HR data analytics, because there's a lot of conversation about the evolving areas that we're measuring and what's important. So actually maybe it's a complete rethinking of those, not the evolution of people data, but actually really rethinking what's the problem we're trying to solve.
Alicia, we'd say that's a sequencing thing, wouldn't we?
Yeah, I think what for me is I've spent a lot of my career in people analytics as well as SWP, and certainly I couldn't espouse the value of that highly enough. The difference for me is that, people analytics can often be detached for business leaders. Why should they care? So why do they need to worry about a turnover in a particular role being a problem if they're not going to need that role in the future? By bringing that back, and you'll remember that second simulation where we looked at, turnovers happening, but we actually need less anyway. By bringing that context of what the organization needs and when, it gets them to understand why they need to care about things like a turnover problem or performance or whatever, because it grounds it back into what the business needs. And so it gives the people analytics that context for mattering. And as Chris said, a lot of analytics journeys start at the bottom and they become a very slow, let's get our people and processes and data all right and 100%, and it takes years, and the business has moved on and made decisions before you've even got your perfect data in place. And you'll never have perfect data, by the way. But if you pivot it around and kind of start with the business context first, it sets the scene, it gets their buy-in, and then they start to care about why we need to invest in talent pooling for this resource, because they're a showstopper for us in executing our business strategy. So we've got to make sure we've got just-in-time hiring for that particular workforce segment. You know, it sets the scene for what matters for your organization across HR.
Yeah, fantastic. And somebody just asked a little earlier, what would be your recommended development, capability development areas for HR business partner, or sorry, for HR to build? Chris responded with business acumen for business partners, plus COEs, capability in analytics and modelling. And doing a shameless plug, we have got our capability development arm, part of our business, which we have both of those programs, business acumen and insights through analytics. So if anybody's interested in some information, I can very easily share that as well. Juliet has just responded as well, saying thank you so much for the presentation. I think, like all of us, such valuable insights. Many organisations are talking about strategic workforce planning, however, are unsure where to start, even where there is a clear business strategy. Do you have any recommendations about where to start to identify capability, supply, demand as objectively as possible?
Yes, and I can see the kind of follow-on comment from Juliet is about this gut feeling kind of approach, and having lived in corporate HR in my own time as well. These discussions that we're having can turn very political, as we all know. I can't advocate strongly enough that you need that, you know, we talked at the beginning that there were 3 A's we were shooting for: the forecast amount, action plans, and alignment. You have got to get these senior leaders around a table together around a shared model to get that alignment piece going. If you try to do this in one-off discussions with folk, HR ends up being the meat in the middle, where the business says, I need more resources if I'm gonna realize these KPIs and goals that you've got for me. And finance says they can't have more resources, you go tell them. And we sit there going, oh, well, I don't really have a view around the financials, and I can't really tell them that we're going to adjust their goals. I guess I'll just get squished. So what we're saying here is you need to bring in front of them this ability to think about demand separate to supply. Supply is what we happen to have today. For better or worse, it's the roles that we've created and the way we've been functioning. But demand is separate to that. What we need today and what we need in 3 years from now, we need to separately think about that, draw it out. And you can't do this in sidebar conversations or even qualitatively. If you try to do this qualitatively in the ELT meeting, everyone nods their heads and go, yep, we agree, these are the priorities. Then they go back and interpret to their own extent, and you get fights over the territory and size of teams and all that stuff. You have to put some numbers down, even if it's a very simplistic model, and force people to go, yes, do we agree this is the customer growth number? Do we agree this is when we're running major campaigns? Do we agree through our value chain, this is how we're going to serve those major campaigns? You've got to create a sense of a value chain that sits across, that each of the senior executives is a part of, and have that conversation of what we need. Then you compare that to what we've got, and you try to pull out that gut feeling stuff. And it can be done at a high simplistic level, but it has to be done separate to supply.
And it probably can seem daunting, just to Juliet's point around where to start. You know, doing that across a whole org sometimes can seem a little daunting. You know, some of our customers will do a whole org view, but from a higher level, but then others do a pilot area. So pick an area that's like really got a burning platform, and just start there. I think the important thing is to get started. You know, the world moves very quickly, as we know, and you'll find yourself just caught in the day-to-day urgency forever. And you're just always reacting and never moving out of that unless you kind of stop, level set, and look to the future. It just is such a much more efficient way to operate in the long term, and it really gets you where you need to go.
We ran a workshop earlier with MetLife out of the US and the UN World Food Program out of Europe, talking about this topic. How do you embark on strategic workforce planning? And even organizations, most organizations don't have a clear strategy that gets down this detail. And we find that where people have started this stuff, the business kind of turns around and thanks you and says, wow, we've never really had this kind of a debate about what we're doing and when into the future. We've kind of set goals, and then otherwise we've worked on budgets, but we've never had something that sits between.
Yeah, fascinating. And again, kind of thinking about the environment that 90% of organizations are in 2021, post the year that was, it's cost is critical. And if you can really identify that direction you're going, what are the resources, and it's actually going to end up being a much more successful and / cost-effective approach, which obviously will no doubt make all the business areas extremely grateful. Elena just shared a question, if I can. I'm just conscious of time, and what we can do is loop back with people a little later. As a strategic, I'm thinking that strategic workforce planning manager, I found it quite difficult to distract leadership from their current problems to articulate the unknown future. Senior leaders are driven by their immediate performance. Any ideas on how to better work with this? Great question, actually.
It's such a great question. And we could probably run a whole session on that. And we have done some on embarking on this. And it is a challenge, Elena, because again, they haven't seen it before. But one of the things that we've seen quite useful is to just sit down with them with their strategy and say, do we have the right workforce today to execute this strategy? Unlikely that they will say we're exactly shaped perfectly and there's no change happening for us. And then you ask very simply that next question: what will the workforce look like 4 years from now? And the other thing that you do on a Post-it note or something is show them the cost of salary and wages today. And the other number that I like to put on that same Post-it note, if we're in a for-profit organization or a business, is our revenue number. If you look at those two numbers and you go, well, salary and wages are a massive cost for us. And if we switch those 15 or 20% either direction, it's going to have a massive impact on our viability. That's a big number for the business to see for a question they can't answer. And if you look at that revenue number and go, well, what happens if we miss that by 10%? That's an even bigger number. That's a big number to miss. And that just helps crystallize for business-minded folk, why are we talking about people? Let me just use one quick example. I know we're very short of time, and Candace, by the way, Alicia has an article to your last question that's coming out in a week, so I'll be sure and send that to you. But we're talking about scenario modeling and demand, and we're talking about the 6 Bs and a lot of stuff. And I know it's a quite meaty topic. Let's take something that's near and dear to my heart. I used to be a performance and reward guy. And I go around begging the managers to spend time on the performance management stuff. Have these conversations, it'll help us. The conversation's much different if you go, in this one critical line of our business, we're short by about 10% of the workforce we need. We forecast demand to next year, and we're 10% short, but we don't have money to go out and hire people. What we do have is managers, and we have managers who aren't being as effective as they could be. If those managers can lift their game by 10%, it's worth $4 million to us over this time horizon. If you spend about $400,000 of managerial time for $4 million of value, you're going to close that gap. And what that manifests in is setting appropriate goals and then holding people accountable to those goals. Will you please participate in my performance management program for a net present value of $3.5 million? It's a totally different conversation. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox.
Just one quick sentence.
Not at all.
It's a game changer. It's a different way of looking at the workforce, and it's a shift from the old finance. That's my old view of the workforce as being just a cost, to the workforce is actually a value generating asset. And Chris mentioned an article, but, you know, it's a push that's happening in the broader world. You know, the World Economic Forum's pushing for accounting standards to be revised to account for the workforce as an asset rather than a cost. It's a new way of thinking, but it requires a fundamental skill shift. But by mind shift. But by bringing those kind of things, like Chris said, you know, the hard dollars, you know, it always gets them to sit up and take notice.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, both. There was just such rich information and great questions from everybody who joined us. What we will do, we've recorded this session, and so we'll have it up on our website, available for anyone who wanted to listen to that again or share it with your cohort. What we will do is we'll send you out a follow-up email with a couple of articles that around this topic that we think that you'd find of interest, and I'm going to put them both on the spot and suggest, given that we've had feedback already from the likes of Francine saying I could listen to Alicia and Chris for hours. Thank you so much. Wondering whether we might extend the invitation and bring you back in a couple of months' time with some additional content that we know everybody would find greatly useful.
We would love that. We love this function. We love the discipline of SWP. It sits in this function, and we're more than happy to come back, given how much the next group kind of invests in this function as well, to kind of help.
Yep. That's brilliant. Thank you so much. And for anybody, I know Chris and Alicia, like everybody, are super busy, but they're so generous with their time and their information. If anybody's got any specific additional questions, they'd be delighted for you to reach out, utilize their LinkedIn pages, or what we'll do is up on our website, we'll have their website links as well, so you can connect with them directly. But thank you everybody for joining us. Chris, Alicia, once again, absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much,
everybody. Thank you, Joe.
Brilliant. Bye all.